Welcome to Shades and Justice. We are very excited to be talking today with Mr. Steve Wade, all the way from Australia. So it is my privilege and my honor to have this wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with you, Mr. Steve. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this. Always love talking about this stuff, so any chance to do that. And yeah, look, my apologies. It's taken so long to find a good time. It's easy to blame COVID and things at the moment. It feels a bit, after. However, yeah, look, we had a string of illness here in the household, so it's kind of upset things. But
yes, this COVID has been running rapid. It's here also in our community. So I'm just glad you were able to get to feeling better, you and your family. And we had this opportunity to chat. So first of all, I want you to know how I found out about your organization.
yes, yeah.
I just happened to be looking online and I saw the word Abigail, and I remember her character from the scriptures.
Yes,
and
yes.
I was awed that there was an organization actually named after this biblical character. And so when I began to read about your organization, I was intrigued and I thought, okay, why not at least try to speak somebody from that organization, even though they're in Australia? And so that's why I'm extremely excited to actually get to talk to you. Well, Steve, tell us a little bit about you and the Abigail Project.
Yeah, sure. So actually, so I started my professional career working with street kids around Hornsby. So Hornsby is on the north side of Sydney, and that was back in 1990. So since then, like I've done a lot of work with teenagers, mostly young people at risk. So often these kids were quite traumatized, not always, but with them and their families. So I spent about 25 years or so in working in that context, and then worked for a different charity for a while, just doing fundraising and IT, and at which point I started some writing projects about abuse and domestic violence, which I'm still sort of plodding away on, and then started the Abigail Project. Started the process of working to get it established as a charity back in 2019. And I guess like in that time, so I was actually studying IT at university and had a pretty profound short-term mission experience in India, and came home and really wanted to make a difference on the home front. But I lived on the North Shore in Sydney. So the North Shore in Sydney is very middle class. It's quite well off. And even though I'd done some youth work around church, I was still like quite sheltered. So my first professional youth work experience, I came across stories there with young people that honestly still haunt me. Just shocking experiences. And I always wanted to remain open to being present with people in those experiences rather than kind of shutting down and getting, people talk about compassion fatigue. Always wanted to push back against that and keep an open heart. And ultimately, so that led to Abigail, that that I saw and still see a need there for, even though there are many people working in the areas of abuse and domestic violence and some wonderful organisations, but I think there are still some particular gaps that need filling, and so we've got a big job ahead. all of us in this field have a huge task ahead. So.
Mhm. Well, I think you're absolutely correct. There are many gaps that still need to be filled, and I have heard of compassion fatigue, and I have heard of not enough funding. There are many excuses for the gaps, but at the end of the day, when someone has been abused and traumatized, they do need someone there to help them, regardless,
Yeah.
regardless. So I just appreciate what you all do, and can't wait to hear a little bit more. I think one of the things that really got my attention about your organization is I saw the several pillars that you all work with: compassion,
Yes.
love, commitment, and presence. So I understand that very well. But I think what really got my attention was the fact that you work with those who have been abused somehow in the ministry.
Yes. And yeah, look, it's really such a broad topic. So look, we've the experience of abuse and domestic violence is very broad, and often there is more focus on domestic violence as a particular context. Abuse is a lot broader than that. But in the Christian community, it does, like, there are similarities and differences, but one of the in Australia, we've had the benefit of having a number of royal commissions. So that might be completely foreign to the American context, but really, like, a royal commission is a high level inquiry that's set up by a partnership between, I guess, the governor and the governor general and the government. So it's a high level inquiry into a particular topic, and we've had several in this area into child sexual assault. There's one ongoing at the moment into abuse against people with disabilities. There's been one into aged care that's really relevant. There was another into domestic violence, and some of the findings that come out of these things are that actually it is when you have abuse operating in faith communities, not just the Christian community, but in any faith community,
yes,
what can happen is that even though, again, in Australia, we have the benefit of a strong investment in public health education by various governments, which is wonderful. But, for example, if a person comes to hear in kind of a public education context that say, for example, if there's domestic violence at home, it's okay to go. But if they believe that their faith says no, so if they think that it is a sin to leave, then if they're a sincere person of faith, they will probably not leave.
Yes.
And actually, when we look at the Bible, the Bible is full of examples of abuse, condemnation of abuse, and actually it does tell us that you're free to go.
Yes.
But often, like, the way that we understand different theologies that ultimately relate to abuse and domestic violence is often have quite a thin understanding of these things that does not help us then to put into practice the things that we need to keep people safe. Yeah, look, that's probably departing slightly from from your question, but so that abuse is in the Christian community. It's not only perpetrated by Christian leaders. It can just be that someone has an abusive partner or an abusive parent who is using the Christian faith, using twisting and the scriptures to keep people trapped, and that. I'm absolutely confident from God's point of view that his holy word is meant to be good for people. It's never
Right.
meant to be a tool to control and abuse people.
Oh, that's excellent. I love that. The word of God was never intended to be a tool to control and manipulate. I don't think you use, I'm adding to your quote, but that's what
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think you
absolutely.
meant. Yeah. And
Yeah,
that is so good. And that is so helpful because I believe that uh, that scripture that says, "My people perish for lack of knowledge," it
yes,
goes into so many different areas where we have a lack of knowledge. So
yeah,
you
yeah,
gave me a couple of articles that you wrote, and
yes.
I absolutely love them. And I'd
Thank
like
you.
to
Yeah,
talk about both of them for a while. Number one, the first one I think was on Saul and his
yes,
abusive behavior and his inability or lack of apology.
yes,
Would
yes.
you like to talk about that a little bit more? I think that was in First Samuel, maybe chapter in around chapter 15 or something like that.
Yes, yeah. So I think the story goes from his story really starts from chapter 13 or 14 and then continues on. I'd have to look
Okay.
up the
Okay.
references to remind myself. But yeah, look, Saul is a really interesting character, and I think actually, you know, like one thing I like to kind of let people know is that obviously if you search for the words domestic violence in the Bible, you'll never find them.
Right.
And actually, if you search for the word abuse, you'll only find a couple of references, which are probably about verbal slander kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you, and this is, I think, where part of the gap is that trips us up, not only in the church but in the rest of society as well. It's not understanding the tactics and that abusers use and what abusive behaviour looks like, other than kind of physical or sexual violence. So
Mm-hmm.
all that manipulative kind of behaviour. But when you read a story like the story of Saul, coming from the point of view, and often people who have suffered from abuse, when they read these stories, if they stop to think for a moment, they will see in it their own behavior, their own experience
Mm-hmm.
of someone else's behavior, and recognize it. And so part of the thing in looking at Saul's story is just to come and think, well, what does this have to say to us about abuse, and how did the people around him experience his behavior? And if we kind of dial back in history and have a look at what he was doing and apply some modern terminology for it. So, for example, he stalked David for years. He was a
Yes, he
stalker
did.
with
Yes.
murderous intent. He sought him out.
Yes.
Clearly, he stated that he wanted to kill him. Um,
Yes.
so this is, I mean, David is far from a perfect character in himself, but
Right.
if you look at Saul's behaviour, you'll see these kinds of things. And so when you see his interactions with Samuel, so one of the things that actually is a little tricky to find in the Bible is really good examples of gaslighting.
Mhm.
So, you know, like gaslighting, many people would be quite familiar with the term these days, but not everyone. The example I used or the comparison I used with my son the other day was essentially that that gaslighting is a particular form of lying where we both know what happened, but I'm trying to mess with your head so that you start to doubt your perception of reality and what really happened,
Yes.
as opposed to me lying to you about something where you don't have an understanding of what happened. So I'm not trying to disrupt your memories or mess with your head. And
Yes.
I think we see Saul gaslighting, or it's a very good chance that he was gaslighting Samuel when
Mhm.
Samuel had an agreement with him about what was meant to happen in this battle.
Mhm.
Came to him and asked him about it. And Saul said, "I've done everything you asked." Um,
Yes.
and actually, and then reframe, like came back to Samuel with a different agreement from the one that they had. And Samuel's a pretty strong character, I think, and you can see that he doesn't buy into it. So without kind of diving into particular verses, which we could do if you want, it's a little bit general otherwise, but absolutely in the story, like we see examples of these things. And you see as it goes on, you see his rage at Jonathan, who he tried to kill. On a couple of occasions, you see that Jonathan, as far as we can tell in the story, only made it out alive after, he ate a bit of honey. And Saul looks like such a narcissistic leader, where you see whatever was happening for him and his goals meant that he starved his men, and then was so furious with Jonathan that he was going to kill him for going against his word.
And Jonathan was his own son.
Yeah, and like my understanding is Jonathan was a pretty amazing character who I think had a wonderful impact on David, actually. But then you see later in the story, even though Jonathan has had this experience of Saul's abuse, David comes to him at one point and says, "Look, your father's going to kill me," and Jonathan doesn't believe him. And then even so Jonathan thankfully goes and tests his theory a bit and finds that actually, Saul is murderously angry, goes back, reconciles with David. But even then, Jonathan doesn't leave.
Right.
So I think we see in these stories that actually when you come and look at it from with an understanding of abuse and how it works, all this is so familiar to what people experience.
Exactly. David eventually, of course, was running for his life after Saul threw the javelin at him.
Yes, yeah.
And like you said, Saul never came to the point where he was apologetic or even changed his mind about killing David. He never really changed his mind. It was all about what Saul wanted, and he forgot how he got there in the first place. And so that it's all very interesting. I appreciate.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Look, I think Saul actually makes a good example of what the Gottman Institute would call a characterological abuser. So someone who is not just abusive because they kind of, it's what they've grown up with, they haven't learnt any better, or they're, they come up with some abusive behaviours when they're under a lot of pressure, but someone who is dedicated to abuse and prefers abuse over other ways of treating people, who is controlling and unrepentant. And Saul, to me, without being able to go back into that environment and have a really close look, but we're given a lot of evidence about his life. And it looks to me like he was one of these people who was really dedicated to harming other people and controlling them.
Okay, well, that was eye-opening. And so in the Christian community, we would hope that people would not be like that. I think Saul suffered from jealousy also, from when the lady said Saul's killed thousands, but David killed 10,000s. And I think that ignited something in Saul that he could not control on his own, which was jealousy. And that kind of was the fuel that pushed him forward to being an abusive leader.
Yeah, look, he looked very much like a narcissist.
Yes.
And, that's very familiar behavior.
So I'm going to move on. I also like the article you wrote about Eli and Hophni and Phinehas, which was Eli's sons. And Wow. I think you wrote in the article, there has been no, and I don't want to say this wrong, but I probably will. But you were saying that it was a harsh punishment that that family received because of sin, because of how those sons treated others. You want to go
Yeah.
into that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think, and so this is a case where uh, it's very clear that that Hophni and Phineas that they were in positions of possibly more power in their religious leadership than anyone else, perhaps other than Eli, and that they were abusing that position. I think it's very clear that what they were doing with the women who served in the temple was sexual assault. And actually, in one of the articles in that series, had a look at that from. I'm just trying to remember the name of the committee, but there was there's a UN committee into violence against women that considered the issue of consent and coercion. And so I went through and had a look at some of the elements from that. But absolutely, these were people with power who if you can imagine going and trying to worship and someone is threatening violence against you for not giving them money, basically. And not allowing you to worship. So it's very clear that they were abusive in a number of different ways, and that Eli, he was growing fat, and it's not often that the Bible sort of comments on people's weight,
Right.
but I think it's clear in this in this particular story that he was benefiting from them stealing from the people. He was benefiting from their abuse, and that he didn't do anything about it. And so I see, this is when I mentioned before about God's word not being there as a tool for us to hurt people. I think in the same way that Hophni and Phineas had. They had a sacred duty that had been given to them by God, a sacred responsibility, and they were using that to dominate and hurt people in horrific ways. And I think then we see God's absolute fury at that, at them, and at Eli, and an incredible punishment that that affected their whole line. And so this part is just conjecture because the scripture doesn't spell it out. But when I think about why would God do something like that, I wonder if a possible motive for God having such strong boundaries is for him to block future generations, future offspring of them, from coming back and changing history. Whitewashing the stories and denying what had happened in the past if they were in positions of power that would have allowed them to do that. But for me also, I think it does illustrate that the depth of God's care about abuse and about victims of abuse, that this is a huge issue. And one of the other kind of really quite shocking examples that we see is the response to Ananias and Sapphira. So when they came, it's not that they were giving money to the church. That wasn't wrong, but there was such a strong response, and so I don't think that that's an example of how we should specifically deal with abuse and manipulation in the church, but absolutely it affirms that it's okay, and that we should draw strong boundaries. So I think what we see in that story, again, without being able to dig deeper than what we actually have before us in the scriptures, but that they had a motive for lying about what they were giving. That would have then, if the lie had been successful, would have meant that their reputation in the church changed. That perhaps it was a way of them gaining a seat at the table, kind of thing, as possibly major donors, and one of the things that I hear in that story is perhaps God saying that abuse and manipulation, lying, this kind of politicking, has no place in the church, and that's a very strong statement of that. And I think actually, thinking about, so Abigail is one of my favourite characters, but also with her husband, who is called this thing a son of Belial, which potentially is a name for abusers, or certainly is applied in the Bible to a number of abusive people. But he was clearly abusive. She was clearly living in a domestic violence situation, and again, and she stood up courageously and effectively to David, which is also a wonderful thing. Like, what a beautiful and courageous character she was. And props to David also for listening and taking on board what she had to say. But again, we see a very strong response from God towards Nabal, who again was unrepentant in his abuse, and who God took things into God's hands, and Nabal died. So I think all these stories show us God's deep concern for people who are suffering, and his anger towards people who are committed to hurting other people. Same as in Jesus talking about, I'm sorry, there's just so many examples, but just in Jesus talking about the millstone, that it would be better for someone to tie a millstone around their neck and jump into the river than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. I see these very strong responses from God towards abuse and abusive behaviour.
Well, I so appreciate this conversation, because I think too often, because of God's mercy, maybe some in the Christian arena have taken advantage, have manipulated, have been abusive, and have not apologized or done any restorative justice acts at all. But our conversation today would encourage those individuals to stop and to repent and to seek God's grace and forgiveness, as well as the restorative justice piece of being able to apologize, being able to do something different instead of continuing the abuse, the neglect, to stop and change and turn things around. I think that's so important. I remember in Proverbs 31, around verse 8 and 9, I say this all the time. It says, speak up for those who are oppressed, those who cannot speak for themselves. And that seems to be part of what you all do at the Abigail Project. You speak up and help. Have you all participated in any policy changes there in Australia around this issue or this topic?
No, look, actually, honestly, we're still very young. And small. So at this point, it's still very early days for us, and there's a whole lot of things that we would love to do if we had the capacity to. But honestly, at this point, this is still me working. I mean, I kind of call it living by faith, but there's no income attached to this. The project doesn't have any employees. So at some point, we would love to be producing white papers, and even sponsoring high-level academic research in these areas, and producing a whole range of resources for people in the Christian community and Christian leaders. So sermon outlines and Bible studies and devotional aids and a whole host of different things. So, for example, like I think it's clear there are many people in Christian leadership who should not be there, who are there for dark reasons. But there are so many beautiful, good Christian leaders who are there because they love God and they love people. They are not necessarily experts in abuse or abusive behaviour. So if they want to lead the people that they're caring for in developing their understanding and developing their character in this kind of area, how can they do that without being an expert? So, we would love to be able to provide those people with some good, rigorous, here's a whole sermon and integrated Bible study series. Do you call Sunday school for kids? Do you call it kids' church over there now? Kids church is kind of like the new name for kids, but an integrated suite. Here's how you can help your church to engage with the issue of saying sorry, or with bullying, or with all these different things without you having to be an expert. But if you've got your theological training in one hand, you have your good heart and your sincere love for God and people in the other. We're here to help, and that's really the vision of where we're wanting to go. At the moment, really, it's just me, sort of just the very tip of the iceberg of doing that, and so helping to be part of sort of policy change or standing with churches who, in Australia, there are many churches. And certainly all the major denominations are working on getting better at this. But if we can stand with them alongside them as specialists to help them in that journey, then that's what we want to do. But in the meantime, we have a lot of growing to do in our capacity.
Well, I totally, trust me, more than you know, I totally understand that, because that sounds a lot like where Shades and Justice is. But I do applaud you, because one of the things I read was that you mentioned it would be good for people to notice behavior that may be abusive, or to notice behavior of someone who has been abused and may be continually abused, and yet they're right there in the church. Well, what can we do to help? So like you just mentioned, just having those skill sets to be able to identify situations like that, and even what to do after you identify
absolutely,
stuff is wrong. What do you do? Who do you contact? What's the best route? What would you suggest?
Specifically about who to contact and what's the best route?
Well, just any kind of overview of what might we do.
So look, honestly, to start with, I think is learning to recognise the signs. So one of the things we're trying to do is to help this behaviour, abusive behaviour, kind of pop out, so that someone does something. It might be obvious if I was physically violent towards someone in church, but what if it's manipulative or bullying or something like that? So to help people to spot this behaviour and go, oh, that's not right.
Right.
Listening skills are incredibly important for all of us, I think, as Christians. I think that this stuff is part of what Paul was saying when he prayed that we would grow in our knowledge and depth of insight about love. It's one thing to just have a good heart. We can get a long way with things like being generous and hospitable and all those things that often many Christians are so good at. But there are other things that take skill, and all of us can work on that. So listening is an incredibly powerful tool. And then I guess it's not that hard for any of us to find out who are the good places to call. So here in Australia, we have this government-funded service, which is 1-800-RESPECT. Now, I think in the US you have it's the domestic violence helpline. I'm just trying
Hotline.
to
We
remember.
got several hotlines, and
Um,
sexual abuse, sexual assault hotlines.
yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And often these services are very good. And and there might be like federal, state, or
Mm-hmm.
even local services. It's really not that hard to just take 5 minutes to go and Google, what services, and just to have an idea that they're there, at least so that if you've got a friend who's in need, at least you remember that you knew how to Google it, even if you don't remember the name of the thing. And
Right.
and so that's incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think then just being like in kind of the professional world, we talk about being client-centered. Or in parenting, you can talk about being child-centered. So just to be careful that what we're doing is that we're listening to whatever it is, the friend or the person in our Bible study that we lead, or whatever the context, that we're checking with them about what it is that they think that they need, right? Because it's so easy for us to, for example, I've seen so many stories where someone goes and just tells the pastor or tells someone in church leadership, and that's not necessarily a good path. Particularly, I mean, you could go and complain to the elders if you have that kind of structure about something that one of the church staff has done to you. That's not necessarily a safe thing to do. So I think to have some awareness of, what might be safe and not safe, and then I know. Again, working professionally in this area, you're always thinking about referring people. So you can be a friend, but you're probably not an expert. So how can you continue to be a friend and do what friends do, and yet refer them to places that can help them to go further?
Yes, absolutely. And I know we are just about out of time. I just want to make one more comment that I read on your website. And I want you in just a second to tell us how we can reach you, what your website address, and what we could do to help you. But first of all, I noticed in your article you said something very similar to this. When we talk about hope, we're not just talking about what God can do later. Often when we talk about hope, we are also including what can we do to help somebody now.
Yes, yeah.
I don't think I said that right, but I think that's what you meant.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Like that principle. Like it'll get me a little moist in the eyes. I can just think of so many people who are struggling right here and now, and they just need a friend, and that actually the current reality, I think this is part of what we see with the story of Elijah in the desert, actually, where he fled from abuse. He was suicidal. Like it's clear in the text, he said, "I want to die."
Yes, he did.
And even we see that kind of thing with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yes.
He was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, and God sent him angels just to be his friends in that moment. And what we see God doing with Elijah in that initial phase, he sent him an angel who. What would an angel do if they turn up? This one, it made him fresh, hot bread, gave him something to drink, told him to have a nap. And, was there as a friend. And then ultimately God said to Elijah, who was out of his mind, I think, with distress, look, here are some good people that you can go and talk to who will be your friends. Reminded him of the incredible story that him and God had been through together. I think with, the whole thing of the sending down the fire to burn up the altar and all that just reminded him of some of what had happened in his history.
Yes.
But this incredible care that was not just kind of this thing that can seem like, this hope that is a long, long way away, but here is some help right here and now. And I think, like, while, obviously as Christians, we have our hope of eternity, but how on earth am I going to be able to get through today or the next week? Or what if I'm suffering with this for years? How on earth am I going to get through that? And that can be such a despairing thing to face. But actually, if we come and stand with people, that we can help them because they're no longer alone. I think Psalm 121, that series of Psalms 120 to 134 has so much to teach us about abuse. But I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. And it can seem like, well, the reality can be that there are mountains. How can we, as Christian people who honestly care, how can we come and stand with people when they're facing mountains? I think that is incredibly important, and honestly, part of our calling as Christians is to practice love in that kind of way. So I do get a bit passionate about it. But awesome. It's just so important, I think. And my heart breaks for people who are struggling and in despair or close to despair, while the rest of us can fairly blissfully perhaps say a quick word and then be on our way and not stay present with them.
Yes. So we're going to have to continue this conversation again. And
sure.
But let me say how much I have really enjoyed this conversation about Abigail's project and the work that you're doing there in Australia. Absolutely phenomenal look. It was kind of like the 3D version of the scriptures. We looked beyond just a printed word and dug into the emotion of the text. And it really blesses me, and it helps open up our minds and our ears and our eyes to see beyond just a printed word, but to see into these characters in the scripture and then relate them to what we've seen here in our churches, in our communities, on the news. I know you all have Google and everybody else too, so you see a variety of different stuff, and but it's good to know that there is a God and that there are good people out there, good Christian people who want to make a difference and who want to help. So with that being said, please share your website information and how people can get in touch with you.
Yes, so our website is the abigailproject.org. So THEABIGAIL project.org. And look, you can find us there. There's a contact form. We'd love to hear from people, always love hearing stories. And it's an absolute delight. It's been lovely speaking with you, Evelyn. And I absolutely love you and your heart, that where you obviously have such a sincere concern for people and for people who are suffering injustice. So it's really lovely to meet you face to face, so to speak. So.
Well, thank you so much, and we will be in touch again. So I'd like to say to everybody before we leave, thank you for joining us at Shades in Justice with Dr. Evelyn Hill, and we're at www.drevelynhill.net. And we had special guest today, Mr. Steve Wade with the Abigail Project. Thank you, Mr. Wade. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.